Men and women need to work together to raise the awareness about this incredible pandemic that is called domestic violence. I think if we know the stats, if we have the nerve to do something, step up when the occasion arises, we can make a difference.
Welcome to the One Girl Revolution podcast. It's your girl, Kate, and I'm so excited to be here for another inspiring episode. If you're new here, please make sure that you subscribe to the One Girl Revolution podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at One Girl Revo. That's the number one girl, REVO. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can find all of our podcast episodes, our social media links, our Emmy-nominated documentary series, and so much more on our new website at onegirlrevolution.com. That's the number one girlrevolution.com. On this week's episode of the One Girl Revolution podcast, I welcome Jan Langbein, CEO of Genesis Women's Shelter and Support. For 30 years, Jan has been an activist in efforts to end violence against women. Under her leadership, Genesis has grown from a 7-room emergency shelter to a full-service response for survivors of domestic violence, and maintained its unique status as one of the few victim services programs that accomplishes sustainability without government funding. Jan is a national expert on domestic violence and conducts training and workshops across the United States. In partnership with the Dallas Police Department and the FBI, she co-founded the annual International Conference on Crimes Against Women, which we plan to cover this coming year through One Girl Revolution, which is so exciting. Jan joins the One Girl Revolution podcast to share her own story, how she became aware of domestic violence, and the pieces to the puzzle that led her to dedicating her life to working to protect women and to bring an end to domestic violence in America and around the world. Jan shares the incredible work of Genesis Women's Shelter. She shares stories from the women that they've served and what we can all do to bring an end to this epidemic, domestic violence in our world. You are going to love Jan in this episode. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Jan. Jan, welcome to the One Girl Revolution podcast.
Thank you. I am so excited to be here today. I think this is going to be a great conversation.
I know it is, and I'm just so excited to have you on to talk about your own life and Genesis and all the great work that you're doing. But before we get into that, I would love to rewind and hear a little bit about your own story. I think that the evolution of the person is so fascinating. And so I would love to rewind and hear a little bit from you about who you are, where you're from, and just a little bit about your story.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a short question. And I'm going to warn you right now, it's not a short answer. But again, Jan Langbein, I'm the CEO of Genesis Women's Shelter and Support in Dallas, Texas. Genesis is a full service response for women and children who are survivors of domestic violence. I was born in Manchester, Connecticut, but it's while my dad was going to Columbia. And as soon as they could, he and my mom got back to Texas. They got back to their roots. So here came these little Yankee kids trying to figure out, what are you saying? What are you saying? But anyway, it worked out great. I am married. I have 2 daughters who I can tell you are the biggest advocates for nonviolence against women. I did great there. I have 2 amazing daughters, and I have 6 flawless grandchildren. So I'm a lucky woman is what I'm telling you. 32 years ago, I actually came on board at Genesis Women's Shelter. I'm not from abuse. I rarely thought about it, to be real honest. I wasn't aware that I knew somebody who was experiencing that. Which I think is so typical, Kate, that if it's not happening to you, maybe you're just unaware, right? So I'm a member of, here comes the long story. I'm a member of the Junior League of Dallas, and like junior leagues across the country and really around the world, there is a volunteer component of your being a member, and you learn about your city. There's lots of benefits, but I was a terrible junior leaguer. I sat on the back row making my grocery list while I looked at major leaguers up there talking about how volunteerism can change your future and you can be better than you were when you came in or something. And I'm just thinking, oh yeah, because I'm back here in the minor leagues. Well, anyway, it was time to go sign up for next year's volunteer placement. And I had one that I absolutely hated. I called it placement from hell. I counted the days until I didn't have any more hours to do. And so I thought, I'm going to look for the easy way out. And I went through the entire list of approved locations to volunteer. And I found it. You didn't have to show up. There was no training. You could wear jeans. I mean, I thought, hot dog, this is for me. So I am heading down Lover's Lane here in Dallas to headquarters to sign up. That's how old I am. It's all online now, but you had to go in and sign up. But I realized I had broken one of my junior league acrylic fingernails. And I thought, well, I want to do well in the community, but I think my nails ought to look good while I'm doing it, right? So I whipped into this salon and I was waiting for the stylist. And all of a sudden, this magazine just slides in my lap. And on the front cover, it said, every 9 seconds in this country, a woman is abused, battered, beaten. And I thought, no way, nobody I know, nobody who lives near me, nobody with a college education, nobody who is Anglo, nobody who's whatever. And I kept making these excuses. And I saw on the front cover of that magazine, 1 out of every 3 women you know will experience some kind of domestic violence in their lifetime or a relationship violence. And it said, 85%, it came down to a thing that said more women will present to the emergency rooms of our area hospitals as a direct result of family violence than all of us who go as a result of rapes and car wrecks and muggings combined. And over here in this corner, it said, domestic violence is the leading cause of injury to women in the United States. Anyway, I was just sort of stunned, and I opened the magazine and I read this article about a woman. They were both professionals. She was a dentist and he a lawyer, or vice versa. And he beat her because dinner was late. And I was just offended. I was like, you got to be kidding me. I have girlfriends, Kate, who stick their fingers in their ears and say, oh my gosh, that has to be so depressing. I'm like, depressing? I am more motivated now than I was 30 years ago when I read that magazine article. Anyway, long story longer, got my nail fixed, got down to junior league, forgot all about the easy way out. And I opened the brochure to violence intervention. And everything those major leaguers were saying at the front of that room, when I wasn't paying attention, is what's happened to me. I was hired. I volunteered for 3 years, and then I was hired as the CEO. It was a very small agency then. It was just the shelter, and it was small, very low budget, and not too many employees. And from there, it has grown. I am so proud of it. It has grown to this full service wraparound response with a trauma-informed method of the way we answer the phone, the way we go to court, and the way we rock our babies. So it's been a long journey, but I've loved every day of it, to be real honest.
It's so incredible what you're doing through Genesis. And I know you've helped so many women and children and generations of people at this point. You think about even 30 years. And I'm a firm believer that when you help one woman, you can not only change the trajectory of her life, but also her children and her children's children. And so it's generations and generations have been helped.
It just grows exponentially, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And it just continues to grow. And I know you're going to continue to evolve and grow in so many ways. But 2 things I want to mention about your story that really touch me is, number one, I think there are so many situations in our lives where we think, oh, I don't know anyone who that affects. I don't know anyone who's in a domestic violence situation. I don't know anyone. You could say it about anything, addiction, child abuse. You go through the list of things. And we live in our own little silo. And so a lot of times we think, I don't know anyone. But the reality is, especially domestic violence, it's so prevalent and prominent in our culture that we all know someone, whether we know it from like right off the bat, or, we know someone who's experiencing that. And so it's so important for us to be informed, to know how to help these women, children. I know men are affected by it. I mean, it affects everyone. But then secondarily, I think a lot of times in life, we just sort of turn a blind eye to things, or we want the easy way out like you did. And it takes this righteous anger, like to learn about something that's going on. And that's a huge part of this podcast, is challenging the way that we all think about things and opening people's eyes to forgotten about populations, forgotten about issues, things that we don't know are going on in our own lives or in our own communities, and opening people's eyes. So we want to do something. We want to get involved. And so I just think that that's so beautiful about your story is you're like all of us. You're like so many people in this world.
Well, thank you for that. I always say that if you want to make God laugh, look for the easy way out, right? It was, but there's another kind of piece of that. When you learn about a need, whatever that need is, you also have to have the courage to step up when the occasion arises. Now, when they offered me the job, Kate, I could have said, no, I don't know anything about budgets. I didn't know I'd never hired or fired. There was no reason that they thought I was capable of taking that job. And, but you know what? I figured, well, if they've got it, I can learn it, right? And so I kind of remember the first go around, I would bring in all the financial statements and lay them out on the floor and say, okay, black numbers are good and red ones are bad, right? So we don't want those. And so I just had to teach myself. And then the way I had no strategy, I had no long range strategic plan going into this. And I kind of just sort of paid attention to what are the roadblocks that keep women and children in the chains of domestic violence. What keeps them there? And I would see, well, she doesn't have access to civil legal representation. She can't afford an attorney. Doesn't mean she's poor. It means maybe he controlled all the finances. She has no money, or she doesn't qualify for, say, legal aid of Northwest Texas is who we rely on, because she's a nurse or she's a social worker or she's a teacher, and that's not enough. You're slightly above poverty, and they won't take you. So we put a legal clinic on site, and I thought, well, she can't go to court if, in fact, her children have no childcare. So we put childcare on site, and then some of our kids started getting snatched out of school by the abusive dad, saying, oh, they have a dentist appointment or something, and he took the kids. And until there's been a court order, possession is 100% of the law. So it ended up that I thought, well, we need a school on site. So we've added that. I also recognize that a 6-week stay in a shelter is not nearly long enough. And so we built transitional housing. And we realized that only a small portion of the battered population ever seeks shelter. So our biggest footprint is actually our non-residential center, where we still provide the same counseling, information, advocacy services, we wrap around that mom and those kids. We get her into the legal department and start help get her a new life. I saw a lady the other day, Kate, that had just finished her case. We had worked on it for a year and a half. And she said, yesterday, my divorce was final. And I said, how do you feel? And tears in her eyes. And she's like, free at last. I'm free at last. And I mean, that gives me goosebumps just telling you the story about it, right? There's so many women who want that freedom, but have no idea how to take that first step. So that's what we do. We are her first steps, whether it is for new housing or even safety planning. If she feels she isn't ready to get out of a situation now, we want her safer in that relationship than she was before. Also recognizing the impact that this has on her children.
And that's it, is no story is the same. I know that the women that you're working with every single day, every person's story and just our stories in general are so unique. We're as unique as our fingerprints, and our stories are that way, even in the good things and in the bad things. But a lot of times the most difficult thing is that first step. And so you're providing that first step, but also these wraparound services for these women and their children, because anything that they could possibly need, you're offering that to them, which is incredible.
Well, I'd like to think it is, but then I lie awake at night and think, well, what about deaf women? We don't have capabilities for deaf women. How do you call out if you can't speak or can't hear? Or then I think, well, what about women my age? And these are women who, is my alternative a nursing home? Elderly women have very few choices. They are living on Social Security, which is deposited straight into his account. They have no, their children are grown and gone. They feel like they can't leave him perhaps because maybe he's ill, but he beats her. and has for 30 years. So what would we do? Again, a shelter stay is not the right thing because it's not long-term enough. So, there's still lots of work to do. And even in addition to services, we have a lot to talk about with regards to legislation. Now, Genesis being a nonprofit, we don't get politically involved except for where it intersects with the issues that our clients face. So access to healthcare for the women we serve, whatever kind of healthcare we're talking about, is very limited. And we have to make statements on that. Guns in the house, for example. And I know a lot of people get worked up about, my right to own a gun. And I say, fine, own a gun, just don't beat your wife, because that's when federal and most state laws say you can't have a gun. But we have a problem getting those for abusers to submit those firearms. And so it's not the work that we do. Yes, it's direct one-on-one, short-term, long-term. We walk beside them with whatever they need. But we also, golly, as a nation, have to stand up and say, I'm scared for her. And what can we do about it? All these horrible, horrible mass shootings, the majority of them are domestic violence related. Here in Texas, there was a shooting in a small town called Sutherland Springs, Texas. And this man, again, he had a dishonorable discharge from the military, never should have had a firearm on him, went to the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs on a Sunday morning, and with the intent to kill his wife and his mother-in-law. And they weren't there that Sunday. And so he opened up on one of the biggest mass shootings we've had in Texas. So it's not just about one husband, one wife. It is the children, but it's also the neighbors and the preacher and the lady holding the baby down the pew and the people in the choir. So, what you were saying about until it happens to us, it happens to us, right? And even the ones who aren't charged with killing their wives, they charge themselves up. They are violent to begin with. So the Pulse nightclub, for example, he was incredibly abusive to his wife before he ever went to the Pulse nightclub and murdered the people who were there that night. We've got to take a look at this from all angles. So again, yes, we're providing as many services as we can, being fiduciarily responsible, but we also have to look at the whole issue. I'm going to shelter from now on, but it's never going to get fixed until we can change the conversation and hold accountable perpetrators, whatever that looks like.
It's so important to talk about all these other issues too, because so many things it's multifaceted, right? Domestic violence, like you're sharing, is multifaceted. Sometimes there's child abuse that's involved. Sometimes there's other manipulation. I mean, a lot of the people that are doing these types of things are manipulative to the people around them, even people at work. I mean, it looks a lot of different ways. So I think it's so important to talk about all these different things and to bring these perpetrators to justice and to create safe spaces. I'm not just saying that culturally, a safe space where you can sit, but no, legitimately where you can find peace, you can find yourself, who you were created to be, because a lot of people, and I'll say people generally, because there are a lot of people that are involved even in domestic violence cases, they are suffocated by fear. And they don't want to step up. And then also what happens if they have that moment of courage to call Genesis, or they have that moment of courage to put their suitcases in their car and run off, and then their husband finds them, and what happens then? So I think it's a lifetime truly of courage and making decisions to take care of yourself and your children and to stand up for yourself. And I also know, and I know you can speak to this, that so many women too, when they have the courage to stand up and fight for themselves and fight for their children, and when they have the courage to get out of a terrible situation, they give other people courage, because I think there are more people than we even know in our own communities and our families, than we know that are dealing with domestic violence cases.
They inspire me, Kate. I see women who, against all odds, end up at Genesis, either our residential or our non-residential. I'd love to introduce you to somebody, a story. This family has moved out, but I'm going to start with a day that they left. They lived down in the valley. very often it's not safe to, even if there is a shelter in your area, it's not safe to go there. You need to go farther. They lived in out sort of in the country, in the valley of Texas, down toward the bottom of Texas. And when her husband would leave for work, they were really isolated at the house, she and 4 teenagers. And she was not allowed out. In fact, he would take spark plugs out of the truck that was left at home, so she couldn't get away. The only place she could go, and this is how incredibly resourceful these people are, he would let her go to the washateria, but he would dole out how much coins she needed. Well, what she'd do is overstuff the machines at the washateria and keep some of that coins, buried it in the yard in a coffee can. She knew someday she would escape, but didn't know when or how, right? And so one day the kids were there, the dad drives off, he forgot to take the spark plugs. That was her day. I can't even begin to imagine how terrified she was. She dug up the money that she had and threw these kids. She actually put a pie in the oven. So if he came home, he thought she would be there back in any minute, right? Puts a pie in the oven and give her a little bit more time, and then throws these kids in the car and drives north on I-35 of life. Now, she ended up in Dallas and called Genesis. And for some reason, I happened to answer the hotline on that one. And I heard the story and I was like, grab your kiddos and come on. We've got a safe place for you. I remember opening the door to this family and these kids just watching and listening their entire lives to this abusive dad. I asked her actually at one point, I said, why did you stop in Dallas? Why didn't you keep going? Because the washateria change was her gas money. And that's as far as she could get with that money. And so she ends up in Dallas in Genesis. Now, I swear this is the hand of God. I don't know what your listeners believe or how they believe it or whatever. I've seen it in action. So she ends up at Genesis and works the immediate, I need clothes for my kids. I need feminine hygiene products or whatever she needed. It's all right there for her. No cost, no strings attached. But then she moves into our transitional housing, at which time she packs her kids in the car and goes downtown to a junior college that's there and says, I want to be a paralegal. And they said, well, you have to take an entrance test. She said, okay, I'll do it right now. No, you have to study. She goes, I'll do it right now. She gives her kids money to go down to the street to McDonald's, eat a hamburger. She passes that test. She is literally hired through that junior college as a paralegal in a law firm where she still works. So now she's got a job. Her kids are all in high school and junior high. The oldest boy, I swear I'll never forget this. He wanted to run track when he first got to that new school, that new high school. Mom said, I am so sorry. I just don't have the money right now for the shoes. Somebody overheard that and told me about it. Well, I'm listening to that story as I'm kind of opening my mail, and a check falls out from this guy who said, I was 7 years old when my mom took me to a shelter in Chicago. And he goes, I just can't believe we survived. It saved our lives. Here's $100. Help someone who needs something special. This kid got the track shoes. And I have this picture of him in my desk wearing this medal. I don't think it was first place, but it didn't matter to him or to me. But that's how it works, right? So it's time to start thinking about leaving transitional housing. Mom is working, the kids are successful in school. They applied on her own to Habitat for Humanity. They actually built their own house, put sweat equity into the house, and literally put a roof over their own heads. Unbelievable. I mean, I think of them all the time. They're grown, they're married. I think that Josh, who had the medal, has children now of his own. And what if we hadn't been there? What if she was out of money and out of time? Anyway, I love working here. It's just, It's so amazing the difference it makes. Her courage encourages me. Her courage keeps me going.
That's it, is I'm sure that there are so many women and even children that are coming through your doors that just inspire you. And women are so resilient. I'm reminded of that every single day when I'm doing this podcast and thinking about these stories where somebody's gone through something that I can't even fathom being in their shoes and having that courage to drive away, in that story that you're sharing, or saving the money. Like, what if her husband had found the money at some point in the backyard, imagine the ramifications for that, that she would have
And
suffered.
they slept in that car. They had no motel money or anything. Those 5 people slept in that truck. And it started with him forgetting to take out the spark plugs. And she was ready. She was ready to go. So
How
freedom,
amazing.
free at last, right?
How amazing.
There's another one. I know,
yeah,
right?
And just again, like her children are now like, look at that, they're thriving in this world, and just the power of a shelter and a community like what you're doing at Genesis. It just has so much power. And I think also for us, listening to those people and striving to be there for them in different ways. We don't have to start a shelter to be able to be there to help somebody, but also listening to their story and being willing to be there for them and help them in any way that we can. Donate to One Girl Revolution's nonprofit organization to help us continue our work, highlighting inspiring women and girls that are changing the world through their lives, promoting their work and their organizations, and building a powerful and positive force out in the world dedicated to empowering women, their voices, and their stories. Donate at onegirlrevolution.com/donate. That's the number onegirlrevolution.com/donate.
I know that your listeners are all over the country, Kate, and I sometimes get people, well, a lot of times people say, well, what can I do to help? I live in here or I live in there. There's really nothing I could do for Genesis. Well, there really is. Number one, get out your credit card. We receive no government funds. And so every gift that's given to us goes directly to providing services for women and children who are in violent relationships. But there's also more. Men and women need to work together to raise the awareness about this incredible pandemic that is called domestic violence. I think if we know the stats, if we have the nerve to do something, step up when the occasion arises, we can make a difference. What are the signs? How do you tell if your daughter is fixing to marry a man who is controlling and abusive? Maybe just verbally at first, not just, but just verbally at first, that we know will escalate into physical and possibly end in death. But I think if we all had the awareness and the guts, the courage to turn to each other and say, you know what, I'm scared for you. I was out at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, is a big airport, and I was just kind of wandering to my gate, and I saw a man yelling at his wife, just get over here with that luggage and give me your passport. You're the one that made us, just berating her in front of the whole gate. A lot of people there, right? And I am like, you are making me crazy. I'm supposed to be someplace else. I need to, get on my way. But of course, I am worried about her. And so I waited till she went to the restroom, and I come up right behind her. And I said, you don't know me, but I have my card and I have written my information, but also the National Domestic Violence Hotline number, 1-800-799-SAFE. And that's for all of your listeners. They ought to be able to roll it off their tongue, 1-800-799-SAFE. And I said, I'm worried for you. And she took the card and kind of looked at it like, lady, I don't know who you are, kind of thing. And okay, I did what it was I thought needed doing, right? And I saw her, did my business, washed my hands, and went back out to the gate. And I saw her, she kept the card. She didn't rip it up, right? And she, he was kind of like, where have you been? And why did it take so long, sort of thing? And she showed him the card, and he was like looking in the crowd to see who it was. And she kind of pointed me out, and I'm like, bring it. Only cowards hurt women. And they're going to find women who are, too afraid of 100 different things, right? I'm not afraid of him. And so he just backs down, and, she puts the card in her purse. And I think about it. I think, gosh, what if she did keep it? What if she did keep it? When I train the Dallas police, I talk about a patrolman's response. And in Texas, you have to, when you respond to domestic violence, you have to give what we call a blue card, which is a blue card. And on it lists Genesis, other shelters, different resources. And so there was this one time a cop told me that he went out to this house and the lady's sitting there and she says, you just need to get out of my house. Get out of my house. You have no business here. And he said, lady, I understand what you're saying, but I need to give you this. And she goes, I don't want any help. I don't need any help. Get out of my house. And so but he handed her the card anyway. She took it, ripped it up and threw it in his face, right? Now, first of all, let's think of who's in that house. She's there talking to a police officer and the abuser's sitting in the lounge chair, right? Watching everything she says and everything she does. It's called secondary safety planning. She was making sure that she wasn't going to be punished for what was what was happening. Anyway, this woman took those shreds of cards, threw them in the trash, except for 214-946 HELP. She stuck that between the lining and the sole of her shoe. And in 6 months later, she was in Genesis Women's Shelter because that police officer did what he could. So if you do reach out to someone, you can't expect an immediate response, right? But that woman literally showed me the shred that she kept in her shoe because she knew one day he would forget the spark plugs for the truck or whatever, the key to the lock or whatever it is that kept her prisoner in that home. So,
yeah, I think it's so important. Even you sharing that story about the airport, a lot of times we may even see something and not say something, or we might talk ourselves out of it because we might see a similar situation and think, oh, if I go up to her and say something, what if it's not? What if it's just her husband's having a bad day? But what if that's not the case? What if she's actually going home to an abusive situation? We have a responsibility to speak up. That's what I always think. We have a responsibility to say something. If we're wrong, at least we said something.
And you're never going to see her again, right? You're never going to see her. She's flying one way and you're flying another. So what have you lost?
Right.
What have you lost, right? Yeah.
Right. And as you were talking, I was thinking about Gabby Petito. So many people know her story and how many people had seen her with her boyfriend or fiance, had seen them on their road trip. And I'm sure that there were other signs. I'm sure that people saw them getting in fights at different things. And even the police officers, I know there's a lot of questions about how they handled things and how they could have done things better. But we, as a society, we as individual people have a responsibility to look for these signs, to say something. Why not say something in a public space when you think about a gas station or an airport? Yeah. What is somebody going to do to you? And also if you get nervous or you get scared in those situations, call law enforcement and say this situation is going on. But there is such a problem in our culture of people not saying something and thinking, oh, that's their business. I don't want to impose. What if I'm wrong? But what if you're not wrong?
What if you're not? Absolutely. And I've made mistakes. I've called it wrong. I'm not clairvoyant, but I just have to think that when somebody walks up to you and says, you don't deserve that, right? You do not deserve, it's not okay for him to speak with you that way or grab your arm that way or whatever. You were talking about Gabby Petito, and we had I can't stop thinking about this little 7-year-old girl. It was on national news, but she was kidnapped by a contract UPS driver and murdered within the hour. This precious, precious little gift from God. And it probably happened 50 miles from where I'm sitting right now. But as tragic as that is, another woman has come forward and said, I told you he raped me and I knew this was going to happen. And you didn't believe me then. Do you believe me now? And I just think about that. And she's like, I'm speaking out. I spoke out then. I'm not going to quit. So I think if we truly listen, believe her and help her as best we can, then we're all doing something that we should be doing in this world, making it a better place in which to live. Yeah, no, I think it is, it's something we all have to be involved in, and particularly men. So you and I were able to chat about this earlier, but we have an auxiliary called Heroes. He respects others. And I give this to your listeners. Do it. Have Heroes in your church. Have heroes in your workplace. These are men who say, I'm not going to hurt anybody in my house, but it's also, and here's the next step, it's not okay with me if somebody's hurting you in your house. And we have over 200 men who have stepped up and paid dues, and they help us put trikes together. They help us, they go to court and sit on the bride's side of the courtroom, and those judges listen to guys in ties, and they play golf for us. They mentor these little guys one-on-one. In fact, if I may, I'm all about stories, and I know you are too.
I love it.
I want to tell you about Randy Golden, okay? Randy Golden, old white guy, about my age, really nice guy, goes to my church, and he is a hero. And he signed up to mentor young boys in our, and it's one-on-one, but mentor young boys in our transitional housing. So he was paired up with this little African-American boy named LaMarquise, really not his name, but very close to it. We don't tell names. But anyway, so Randy would come once a week. And the deal is, it doesn't matter what you're doing. You fly in a kite, you're learning to ride a bike. That isn't it. It's being with that child, a gentle man being with that child. And so Randy came into the apartment complex a little early, knocked on the door, and there was no answer. So he looked, and he's not home from school yet, right? So Randy goes on down to the supply room, and he's pulling out, LaMarquise loves Legos. And so he was pulling out all the new Lego kits and kind of setting it up. And all of a sudden he hears the front door slam, and he hears LaMarquise yelling, Randy, Randy, are you here? Randy, Randy. So Randy comes down the hall, right? Faces him in the lobby and says, yeah, buddy, I'm here. This little boy looks up at his mom and says, see, I told you he didn't lie to me. I told you he promised to be here. Then, wait for this one. I'm going to have you crying before this podcast is over. Randy looks at this little guy and says, hey, buddy, I see you got a haircut since last week. And he said, is that like for school or what is it? And he said, I cut my hair like yours because I want to be just like you. LaMarquise and old white guy. I'm telling you, there was no difference in that moment. He saw a gentle man. He saw a good man who was not there to hurt him, but there to be his friend. And again, it makes me so proud to know that these men now are equipped with courage to sit in court and say, I'm not voting for you if you do not pay attention to this sexual assault outcry. And every community has those good men. So anybody who is listening today, if you want to know how to start a Heroes program, call me. I am, as we say in Texas, mi casa es su casa. And you can have whatever I've experienced, good or bad, and I'll tell you how to start that. We have Students Tackle Abusive Relationships, another auxiliary where we're in the high schools talking about this. So there's just a lot that, and again, I'm happy to share if there's anybody out there, a church, a corporation, anybody who would like to set up something like Heroes. I'd love to share it.
Watch One Girl Revolution's Emmy-nominated short documentary, The Girl Inside, on our YouTube channel or at onegirlrevolution.com. The Girl Inside features a poignant look at the stories of incarcerated women within Cook County Jail and a life-changing academic course taught by Dr. Laura Biaggi called Storytelling as a Healing Art. This short documentary reunites Dr. Biaggi with 5 of her former students for a special one-day course on the transformative power of our stories and our voices. And what is revealed is the girl inside. Watch the Emmy-nominated short documentary The Girl Inside today on YouTube or at onegirlrevolution.com. So I'd love to hear, I know you've shared a few stories, but thinking about a woman, I know you offer a lot of different wraparound services, but I would love to hear a story of a woman, maybe from the time she called you, that kind of exhibits all of the great work that you do and kind of your journey or her journey with Genesis. Could you share a story like that?
Each person who calls is completely different. And it's as if we are one big building and they come into us through different doors. Some women come who are very, very functioning, and they actually need to know how to apply for a protective order here in Texas. Or some women come in, and I remember one woman who was in her final years of residency at our UT Southwestern Medical School just down the street from where I am. But But most programs, if you move into transitional housing, will make you quit school and get a job. We were able to bring her in. She went into transitional housing. She didn't quit her job, didn't quit school. And now she's a physician, full specialist, who I hope is recognizing the signs in someone else. There was, and she was the one, I believe, where when she came into Genesis, all our clients are met by a treatment team. So what would you need? Well, he broke my glasses when he smacked me in the face. Your advocate would help you with new glasses. I need help with getting a protective order. Your legal advocate would help you with that. But there was one woman who came in, and this abuser was tracking. They were very affluent, and she drove a big Lexus SUV, right? And he was tracking her through OnStar. And we had to figure out, a bunch of social workers right out there with tools that we didn't know what they were. We were trying to disconnect the OnStar, basically, so he couldn't track her. So that was the first advocacy effort we made. The next day, I was talking to the press, actually, and I happened to mention that story about how, GPS can whatever, but I did use the brand name OnStar, which I shouldn't have done. That afternoon, I get a call from General Motors, right? It's a call from Detroit saying we would never endanger somebody. And I said, well, let me give you this scenario. Let's say I am taking my college-age daughter down I-35 to the University of Texas to get her back into the dorm for this next semester. And my husband calls you guys and says, I was talking to my wife on the phone. She has dropped off. I'm afraid she may be in trouble. Can you please tell me where she is? Oh, absolutely. Right here at the corner of such and such and such and such, which is exactly where she was, right? They didn't mean any harm by it, but the OnStar account was in his name. The car was in his name. We've had men, abusers, who report the car stolen so that the police help them find the car. These guys are just incredible. So the bottom line is, on a story, someone either can just walk in a door and say, I need help right now. Not the shelter, but our non-residential. We have capabilities for walk-ins. But as far as the usual process is that, like the woman from South Texas, she called a hotline. She parked down the street and she called our hotline, our helpline. And we were able to say, tell me what's going on. Are you safe right this minute? And we begin that process, that trauma-informed approach of understanding not so much what's been done to her, but where we're going to go from here. It's not that he slapped me. It's how it felt to me when he slapped me. It was the betrayal and the anger and the hurt. It wasn't that a sexual assault lasts about 20 minutes, but it's 20 years of the rest of my life, right? So we meet her, each one at the door, whichever door it is, with this team that says, I'm going to walk beside you. You need a plane ticket home? We can get that plane ticket home. Your children need special time with our occupational therapist? We've got that here for you. You need a lawyer? We've got that here for you. Our motto is really find a way to say yes. And that may be, yes, we're too close to where you live. And so we're going to, yes, find you a safe place in another part of town, or Fort Worth or Waco or wherever we have to go. And so, there's really no typical what happens because there are many doors at Genesis. She may start with legal. He's stalking me. I need to get to safety. So maybe we get her in shelter, long-term shelter, get a job, save for a house, an apartment, match those savings. So anyway, that wasn't a very direct answer for you on that question. But again, where she comes, where she enters into Genesis, we stand ready to make a difference for her, help her make a difference in her life.
Yeah. And I know every single phone call, every single person that you encounter, every story is so different. And so I know it's, there are a lot of different facets, but it's so critical what you're doing, where no matter what this woman shares or what she's experiencing, you're able to step in and support her and help her feel safe. Yes. I'm curious, because you're telling different stories. Have you ever had the husbands show up? I'm sure that you do. And what's your process for protecting these women?
Yeah, it's terrible. I mean, we had one man, I remember, hid in the trunk of his wife's car at work, and he she basically drove him there. Well, what he didn't know is we had Officer Bill was sitting on the other side of the door and was able to go out and actually, I don't know that he could be arrested for that, but, told him to get on about his way, right? But unfortunately, she had to leave Genesis at that point. Genesis was no longer safe because it was no longer a secret location for her. So right in the middle of everything else, pack up her kids and shoot, she has to leave in the night again, right? But for another safe place, but better than knowing about that. We've had men call me. I remember one that said, I'm the fire marshal and I need to know where you are. I immediately start thinking about the Vent-A-Hood because we were written up on it last time. And I thought, wait, if you're the fire marshal, you know where I am. And so he starts cursing at me. I want my blah, blah, blah. And I just, hung up on him. We've had guys, knock on the door and say, hey, I am looking for Genesis. And I'm like, we really are good liars. So it's like, I don't know what that is. And they said, well, what is this? I'll be, an insurance company, right? And so sometimes that's what it takes. Or if they're acting really badly, we just call the police and get them taken away. So we know they're not there to be kind, right? It's a priority one when they're banging on our doors because he's come there like First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas. We know of what he's capable.
And for women that may be in danger being at Genesis, you have a network that you work with in Texas, right? Where you can safely transfer them over somewhere else.
So what we can do is actually call the National Domestic Violence hotline, and they can help us connect and do a soft handoff to another program. But here in Dallas, this is something relatively new. There are 3 or 4 shelters, 5 in the Metroplex here at DFW, and we're able to go on an app and each of us know where there is an empty bed somewhere else. So I don't just give a woman, if you call me and I said, we're full, but here are 10 other numbers, go ahead and call those and good luck to you, right? And she has to tell her story 9 more times, right? So anyway, now we can look and say, well, Safe Haven in Fort Worth has an empty bed. Let me call them and see if, they have room for you and your children. And so we're really trying to be better at making it a one-time call for her so she doesn't have to go through it and then give up halfway through it, right?
That is so critical too, because you even think about if you have one moment of courage to make that one phone call. I even think about like having to call customer service, and I think everyone can relate to this. And you're like, all right, you can set aside 5 minutes to call whatever, and then you get bounced around and then you can't get to the right person, and then it ends up taking hours. And the majority of these women don't have hours, they have seconds. Right. And so that is so critical what you're doing where you're able to find placement for these women and their kids. That's amazing. So Jan, in your dream of dream, I know that it's evolved so much in the 32 years under your leadership. You've seen it evolve so much. And I know that there are things that you're working on, but in your dream of dream worlds, where do you see Genesis going from here over the next 5 or 10 years? What are some things that you hope to see Genesis accomplish?
I guess it's even bigger than Genesis. Genesis is, very true to the mission in providing services and raising awareness and educating and all of that, both locally and nationally. But I want it to be, my dream of dreams is that it's a bigger conversation than that. Before I die, I want to change the conversation. I want to move the needle from why doesn't she just get out to why does he do it? What kind of coward beats the mother of his child? What kind of monster beats a woman in the first place? Why are we putting the onus on her, whether it's domestic violence or sexual assault, to have to prove that she's right? There's a person in this field, very well known, Dr. Jackson Katz, who's an advocate. And I heard a training that he did one time, and he was talking about how the media talks about these kinds of issues, right? And so he said, let's think about it. Monday, the newspaper says, John beat Mary because dinner was late. Tuesday, the newspaper said, Mary was beaten because dinner was late. Wednesday, it said, Mary was beaten. And Thursday, it said, Mary is a battered woman. So going from only one day talking about John she was beaten because dinner was late. She was just beaten, and now she's a battered woman. She is identified by something that happened to her. Where is John? I mean, I could get really worked up over where the heck is John, right? And it's going to take all of us. It's going to take, Kate, in my opinion, a societal paradigm shift so we stop asking stupid questions. I can tell you all the reasons why she didn't leave. I can tell you hundreds of reasons why she didn't leave. It's as different as every person who did or didn't leave. But let's stop asking that and start saying, what can I do to impact this? What can I do to make a difference? Can I pull together heroes? Can I talk to my Cub Scout group about, hands aren't for hitting? Or what can I do to make a difference in this epidemic? Every 9 seconds, Kate, every 9 seconds. So yeah, I that's my dream. And I hope to be coming back here in about a year with a book because I am on fire about that. So anyway,
that's amazing. And we'll have you back on and of course promote your book, but we need to be talking about these issues and these stories. And I'm so grateful for everything that you're doing and grateful to highlight your story and to highlight the story of Genesis on here, because like you said, we all can do something.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Like you shared before, of course, people can donate to Genesis. They can volunteer, but even in our own communities and our own lives, our own families, we need to keep our eyes open and look for opportunities to help women in situations. I'm going to be thinking about every time I go to the airport now, thinking about that story that you shared. We need to look and know what resources you can offer. And you shared earlier the 800 number that you want everybody to remember. So I'm going to ask you to share it again.
Thank you. It's 1-800-799-SAFE, 1-800-799-SAFE. So, and it's answered 24 hours a day. You can call it, you can text it. It's really, and if you need to flee to Hohokus, New Jersey, they can, have a soft handoff to New Jersey from Dallas, Texas. So it's really a great resource. I invite people to go to our website. And again, if there's anything I can share, I'd like to. You had asked me last time we talked who, in my opinion, represents a one-girl revolution. And I'd love to share that with you if we still have time.
I would love to. Yeah.
Okay. See, now I'm asking
who is a one-girl
questions.
revolution? Yeah. Who is a one-girl? I always ask that. So yeah, who is a one-girl revolution in your life?
There is a woman named Cindy Dyer. And I first met Cindy when she was a misdemeanor prosecutor here in Dallas, Texas. And the way they do it, at that time, they kind of run people through all different courts. So you never knew what judge you're going to get or what the deal was going to be. And she actually helped form a designated domestic violence court at the misdemeanor level. She went on to prosecute felonies, domestic violence felonies out of this unit. And just brilliantly, one of the first ones that I remember that she did that I remember her especially for, was a woman who had been nearly killed. She actually was a client of Genesis, and he beat her with the claw end of a hammer. And the only reason she was alive is she had rolled up her hair in those pink foam curlers. And that saved her life. Well, she moved to Louisiana, Mississippi, or someplace and said, I'm not coming back. I'm not coming back. I don't want any part of that. But the trial went on, right? And so the judge said, hey, no witness, no trial. Cindy Dyer, I don't know how old she was at that time, 35 or something, stood up to this judge, elected official, and said, we don't have a victim in a homicide, and yet we still try to find justice, right? And so she pushed forward with the help of, some agency with a volunteer coordinator who sent over a bunch of volunteers sitting in the courtroom, right, with these big badges that said, I vote. I'm here and I vote, basically. He made him take the badges off. But at the end of the day, this guy got like 45 years in prison, and rightfully so. Anyway, Cindy, she was, as we say here in Texas, she was like a dog on a bone with these domestic violence cases. Well, last Wednesday, She had her Senate confirmation hearing. President Biden has appointed her a United States ambassador at large. She is over trafficking in persons. And I was able to watch her hearing remotely. And for us to have someone like that, President Bush, this is interesting too. President Bush actually appointed her a Senate confirmed appointment to be director of the Office on Violence Against Women. So these two presidents, President George Bush, President Biden, realized this is not a political thing. And through the work that Cindy has done and continues to do, to me, whether you call it a one girl revolution or a dog on a bone, that represents Cindy Dyer to me.
That's amazing. And I love that you shared both George W. Bush and President Biden, have seen her and seen her work and care about this issue, because this is a nonpartisan issue. It's not something we all need to speak up. We all need to do something to protect women, to support women in this world. And I love so much about what you're doing. And I love that you shared that story. But Jan, I'm curious, as you were telling some of these stories, I know that you're dealing with really brutal, difficult stories a lot of times, really heartbreaking things. You're seeing these kids show up, you're seeing these women show up, oftentimes with bruises or, have come through really horrific situations. What drives you to keep going? I know that these women, their faces, their stories, their courage gets you to keep going. But if you could get to the root of why you do what you do, what's the driving force behind everything that you do on a daily basis?
Yeah, Kate, it's that woman who tipped her toe in the water and is sitting in the waiting room of our non-residential. It's the mom who came in with this child, this precious child, who is severely on the severe end of the autism spectrum and was not 6 years old, nonverbal, basically could not sit in a chair. We had to start him with a high chair and then a booster. And now, after a year in our transitional housing, he's sitting in a chair. We taught him flashcards and he can communicate. But talk about abuse, medical abuse. That mom knew something was wrong and dad would not let her take this child to the doctor. I can't imagine how many beatings. I don't know if you've ever been around a child with autism, but on the spectrum, but it's very challenging. It's exhausting. It's challenging. And when this little boy would get upset, he just screamed at the walls, screamed for significant lengths of time. And I wonder how many beatings mom got from throwing herself in front of this little boy. And she did it because she's the mom. And these mothers amaze me. So that's what keeps me going, right? What gets me down is the fact that we have a 400-person waiting list on our non-residential services. All the more reason I get out there and I buy some land, and we're trying to finish up a capital campaign. That's another way some people can help to build this amazing building, which will now enable us to double our capacity of services. So that makes me excited. We have also, part of our strategic plan has always been to address issues in underserved community, whether that's Indigenous women, Alaska Native women. But here in Dallas, it is primarily women of color. African American women are assaulted 35% more often than white women. Hispanic women are not quite as high as African American, but still higher than white women. And so we actually, we would try different things and have a luncheon and try to raise awareness. But at the end of the day, we just opened an office down in Southern Dallas at the corner of dangerous and no resources. And we have started work in that community with staff that is very relatable. And so what's next, right? So that's, I guess, now that I've had this therapy session with you, thank you very much. I think it boils down to what's next. What are we going to do next to stop this? I want the conference to grow. I want more police officers and first responders and probation officers and advocates to come to this conference, May 22nd, conferencecaw.org. We have the best of the best presenters from all over the world. And so my dream is, again, that this conference moves the needle on the response to victims and accountability for perpetrators. So yeah, I got a lot to do. Yeah.
It never ends, Jan. It's like one thing after another. And I know that you've served so many women throughout the 32 years that you've been in leadership, but there are so many others, like you said, 400 women on the waiting list. And there's so much for us to do. And I just want to encourage everybody. I will be sure to put in the show notes your website, your social media links. I always say on this podcast, a free and easy way to promote the work, support the work, to share the work that you're doing is through social media. So follow Genesis and share on your social media. Of course, donate, volunteer, and say something like we've talked about. It's so important. If you see something, say something, but this is so critical in this world. And get educated. You mentioned Indigenous women. We've done a few things on this podcast, and I hope to do more to cover the missing and murdered Indigenous women, immigrant women. I mean, there's so many different forgotten about populations, and we need to talk about it. And so
Absolutely.
I'm just grateful for all that you're doing to serve these women. And I will be sure to post about the conference. So I want to encourage everybody. People have time now. You know, they have a good few months to get their plans in order to go and support the work that you're doing through this conference. So I will be sure to put that in the show notes. But Jan,
hey, that's an example. An example of that is, let's say just you have a woman who works out of her home listening to the podcast, right? Well, she probably won't come to the conference, but you know what? Go on down to the local police station and say, here's a brochure on this. I think, my community will be safer if you have a team go to this conference, right?
That's a great point, though. Even that, we don't necessarily even have to go to the conference, but reach out to your local police department and encourage them to go to this conference. Share it on social media. If you know people that are first responders or in law enforcement, or anyone that is affected by this issue, it's so important for us to be educated and for us to do something. So I just want to encourage everybody to share it on their social media. I will put the link in the show notes so people can find out more information. But Jan, before I let you go, I always end this podcast on one question. So I'd like to ask you, if you could leave women and girls around the world with one message, what would it be?
I would say, if you're experiencing abuse, number one, it's not your fault. And number two, there is help and there is hope.
Well, you're doing so much great work, and we can all do something. You're such a great example of that we can all do something to support women, but every person, right? Like we mentioned earlier, it's not just women that are affected by domestic violence. I know there are situations where men and children, so many others come into this, but we need to be educated and we need to spread awareness so people can also share this episode too if they want to find out more. But Jan, thank you so much for being on the One Girl Revolution podcast, and thank you for all the incredible work that you do. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at One Girl Revo. That's the number one girl REVO. And you can find more information on One Girl Revolution at onegirlrevolution.com. That's the number one girlrevolution.com.